Okay, so I'm Matt Cadnar from the Nebo team here at GMO. Nebo actually is a tech startup within GMO. It's the first time we've done something like this. Nebo actually stands for needs-based optimization, and so this is actually an idea that is about 10 years old. Ben Inker, the head of asset allocation, was speaking to a corporate client, and the corporate client asked if he had thoughts on their glide path and their DC plan. And so Ben went to talk to Martin, and Martin did some research to try and understand how glide paths were constructed. And as he kind of dug deeper, what he found out, it was far from clear how Vanguard and T. Rowe were actually creating these glide paths other than kind of the traditional 110 minus your age. And so kind of true to GMO roots, they went back to first principles and they said, what is the biggest risk that the end owner, the retiree, faces? And it certainly wasn't volatility. It was not having what you need when you need it. And so that idea they wrote up in a white paper in 2013. Martin went away, spent 5 years working on some rather gory math to try and operationalize this. Then in 2019, we started going out, talking to RIAs, and had a cohort of firms that we worked with to build the minimum viable product for Nebo. And then in the fall of last year, we launched Nebo out to the world. We have 11 signed clients. We have almost $2 billion of assets on the platform. And we have about 20 firms that are demoing Nebo in one way, shape, or form currently. And so that brings us to today. So we have the mysterious case of the missing required rate of return. So somewhat Arthur Conan Doyle-esque. Martin's going to take you through that mystery. When you redefine risk as not having what you need when you need it, there's a whole host of behavioral issues that unlocks that Nebo addresses. And so James is going to take you through that, and then I'll wrap up trying to bring this a bit to life. So with that, Martin.
Thank you, Matt. So our story begins really with one of the central planks of the wealth management process, and that's the investment policy statement. So if you go to the CFA Institute and you look at what the CFA Institute has written about investment policy statements, what you find is an investment policy statement is a written document that clearly sets out a client's return objectives, risk tolerance over that client's relevant time horizon. So there are three primary elements of the investment policy statement, and this really defines the client profile. What is their risk tolerance? What are their return objectives? And what is their investment horizon? But when you look out in the real world, and this is a screenshot of the output from one of the dominant financial planning reports that are generated, what you find is that the risk tolerance is the primary driver of the client's portfolio. In this example, it says you choose a risk score of 60, and therefore your percentage stock is 61%, and that is not a coincidence. So in the real world, the required return and the time horizon are almost entirely left out of the process. What this means is that the link between what advisors are doing on the financial planning side and what they're doing on the asset management side is primarily driven by the risk tolerance questionnaire. But this is a problem because if you change financial planning inputs, not much changes on the portfolio side. And the portfolio is really where the rubber meets the road. Advisors know that this is a problem. So we've run a number of webinars over the last couple of years, and one of the questions that we've asked advisors who attend these webinars is we ask whether or not they struggle aligning their client's financial plan with the portfolio. And 58% of advisors say they struggle aligning the plan with the portfolio. We've also asked them whether or not they observe a gap between financial planning and asset management, and 89% of advisors say they observe a gap. It's hard to imagine 89% of advisors agreeing on anything, but there you have it. Now, what's really interesting about this problem is it's actually not new. If you go back and look through the time machine to 1985 and you look at the book Investment Policy by Charlie Ellis, In chapter 4, he talks about the paradox that is haunting investment management. The paradox is that funds with very long-term purposes are being managed to meet short-term objectives that may be neither feasible nor important, and they are not being managed to achieve long-term objectives that are both feasible and worthwhile. In these two sentences, he's really laying out the essential tension between the long-term and the short-term, and the importance of asking the right question. What problem are you solving? So everybody knows this is a problem, and people have known for decades this has been a problem. So why hasn't it been solved yet? It hasn't been solved yet because it's a really hard problem. It's a hard problem because it's more than a portfolio problem, it's also a people problem. You have complicated clients, you have chaotic markets, and you have financial advisors that are caught between the complicated clients and the chaotic markets. But at the root of it, it's a much deeper problem because it's a theory problem. It's a theory problem because of the way that modern portfolio theory views risk. Modern portfolio theory views risk as volatility. And when you view risk as volatility, you only have one choice. It's the risk tolerance questionnaire that drives the link between the plan and the portfolio. So to solve this problem, we need to redefine risk. And if you think about risk as not having what you need and when you need it, rather than risk as volatility, this is the key to linking the plan and the portfolio in a coherent, economically meaningful way. So at its core, Nebo is a portfolio construction engine that minimizes the risk, or attempts to build portfolios to minimize the risk that the client doesn't have what they need when they need it. So what this really represents is a paradigm shift in how advisors think about portfolios and how they talk about portfolios. And Nebo is really bringing the required return and the time horizon out of the shadows. You can kind of think about it this way, as modern portfolio theory has held captive the required return. It's in the investment policy statements, but it's not really operationalized. And what Nebo is doing is operationalizing these core concepts of required return and investment horizon. What that means is that the model cookie-cutter portfolios that are really driven by this hyper-focus on risk tolerance, we can break that, and now we can build personalized portfolios for each individual client that are suited to their required return, to their time horizon, and to their risk tolerance. It's not that we're throwing risk tolerance out. We're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's very important to incorporate that into the process because the behavioral elements of that, as James is going to talk about, are really important. So we have to incorporate that. But you have to balance that with these crucial elements of required return and investment horizon. So one way to think about this is that the hyper-focus on the risk tolerance, it's as though you're really looking at the client, at the asset owner in a one-dimensional way. You're seeing a one-dimensional profile, and it's as though the advisor is talking to the side of the client's face. But when you bring return horizon, required return and investment horizon into the problem, you can now see and speak to the client in 3 dimensions. You can look them in the eye, and you can fundamentally change the nature of the conversation with the client because you're asking the right question. You're starting with the question, what do you need and when do you need it? And this focus on the question that really matters really ties into core behavioral elements. The core behavioral elements, as James is now going to talk to you about, start with this idea of focal bias. And by focusing the question on what really matters to the asset owner, it sort of breaks the Gordian knot of a lot of behavioral issues.
That's cool. So, I'm back. So thinking about the way that people make decisions, it really is important to think about the human as a cognitive miser. That is to say that evolution has designed us to be as stupid as we can be and get away with it, right? The brain is an enormously expensive organ to run. And so if we can avoid using it, we will. And that gives rise to a whole gamut of potential problems. So this idea that we are trying to minimize the amount of cognitive capacity that we have to use means that often we end up defaulting to our emotional decision making. If we do try and become rational, we end up using only a select amount of inputs, right? We rarely bother collecting all the relevant information. Instead, we tend to focus too narrowly. Even if we do start out trying to be rational, we sometimes fail. Okay, we reach a point at which suddenly our emotional system kicks back in. And then occasionally we have what I've called here mindware gaps and contaminated mindware, which are really processes that are operating with our mind that really aren't accurate. Okay? So the one that we want to talk about today is actually one of these limited attentional focal biases. So this is where we've attempted to try and be rational, and I think that's what the risk tolerance questionnaire is. It's an attempt to try and be rational, but it is simply focusing too heavily on one aspect. And that's a behavioral problem known as anchoring. And anchoring crops up in lots of different ways. This is a lovely example by Dan Ariely, George Lowenstein, and Dreesen Prelec. And they separated people based on their social security number. In fact, their last 2 digits of their social security number. They asked them to write down those last 2 digits and then asked them how much they would pay for various things, a trackball, a keyboard, fine wine, etc. The people who had high social security numbers, oddly, were willing to pay between 2 and 3.5 times as much as the people with low social security numbers. So despite the fact the social security number had absolutely no relevance to their decision making, it clearly impacted their willingness to pay. You can tell these are MBAs, by the way, because clearly they seem to think a keyboard is more valuable than a fine wine, which shows they need to get out more. We see the same thing with judges. Okay, these are experts. These aren't masters of bugger all. These are guys who actually have 10 years of experience sitting on the bench. And yet they were asked to roll a pair of dice. Because the guys were psychologists, those dice were loaded. And they were either going to give the number 9 or the number 3. Of course, it was a random outcome as far as the judges were concerned and shouldn't impact the sentence that they imposed, except it very clearly did. This was a shoplifting case, but if you happen to have rolled a 9 as a judge, you were going to give this poor person 8 months in jail. If you happen to just get the dice that gave you a 3, you only gave them 5 months in jail. So even experts are massively biased by strangely odd and, quite honestly, completely irrelevant inputs. I found the same thing when I was working with fund managers. I asked them to write down the last 4 digits of their telephone number. And then later on, I asked them to estimate how many doctors there are in London. It turned out that those who had a telephone number of 7000 or higher thought on average there were 8,000 doctors in London. Those who happened to have telephone numbers of 3000 or lower thought there were about 4,000 doctors in London. It turns out, rough estimate, there are about 4,000 doctors in London. But the point is, their answers were massively determined by their telephone numbers, a massively irrelevant input. And that's the habit that we get into, clinging to, frankly, irrelevant information. And this is completely irrelevant. If we make it partially relevant and say it's the risk tolerance, imagine how clinging we will get to it. And it's amplified by institutional factors. Martin referred to a theory problem, and he's absolutely right. Right? Max Planck pointed out that science advances one funeral at a time. Sadly, he's all too right. But modern portfolio theory gets used like this. You can see here, the risk tolerance measure is put on the x-axis. And the x-axis for mathematicians traditionally denotes the independent variable. So this tells us that the risk tail is wagging the entire dog. So everything is driven by the risk tolerance. That's madness. It is akin to shoe size investing. Many years ago, I wrote an article on shoe size investing. These are not all shoes from my closet, just to be clear. But it is akin to going in and saying, oh, I'd happen to take, in my case, a size 10. And then everyone goes, there's your shoes. Instead of asking me what I want to do. You know, if I'm going out running, if I'm going out I have no idea why I'd wear brogues, but maybe I would. If I was going trail hiking, or if I was doing ballet, or if I was heading Saturday night on the town in my best stripper heels. The point is, it's madness. Yeah, there's an image you want to get out of your heads quickly. It is madness to think that just one single number can possibly determine everything. And yet that's exactly what is happening with this particular problem. And so how do we deal with it? Well, it turns out that, behaviourally speaking, debiasing is really hard. We can't wave a wand and stop people being human, and we probably shouldn't. I refer you back to my AI speech earlier. But we can probably do something better than debias. We can rebias. We can turn that habit of anchoring to our advantage. And there are two ways that I think one can do that, and Nebo actually does both of them. The first is to provide a better anchor. And that's the point that Martin was making. Focus on what you need and when you need it. By changing the framing of the problem, we are changing the central role of risk tolerance, right? We remove that from the investment process, or at least downplay it a lot. The second approach to avoiding the anchor is something I've talked a lot about in a different context, and that's reverse engineering the problem. And over the years, I've done a lot of reverse engineering and presented the results on the stage at Quality and the S&P and all sorts of things. But the basic idea is to back out what is implied, in my case, by a sector or a country, and see whether there's any chance of that actually being delivered. But you can do the same thing here. We can reverse engineer the risk tolerance into, well, what does it mean for your returns? And it's on that note that I should turn over to Matt to take you through an example of exactly how that works. Oh, there he is. How'd you get from there to there? You're the great Houdini. There you go, my friend. Cheers, buddy.
All right, so with that as a segue, so one of the things that Nebo does is it integrates financial planning from cash flows from financial planning software. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. So what we have here is a cash flow report from Money Guide Pro. And so we can take the initial wealth, the wealth at retirement, wealth at longevity, and we can reverse engineer, just as James talked about, an implied required return. So here, 2% real is after inflation, taxes, and fees, but we'll just call it 2% real for short. And so those with good vision here will see that in the Money Guide Pro plan, we've outlined this column in yellow. So there is a column for returns in this financial plan. So why are we calling this an implied required return? We call it an implied required return because the advisor never said, can I see what the plan looks like with a 5% return? Where that 5% return came from was the risk tolerance questionnaire. And specifically, the risk tolerance questionnaire had a risk tolerance of 60. That's mapped into a model portfolio. The model portfolio has an asset allocation, and that asset allocation has the required return, or the return of 1%. So when Martin talked about the plan not being connected to the portfolio, we can change all of the goals for this client. We can change all of the cash flows for this client, but the portfolio return is not going to change. The portfolio itself isn't going to change. It stays static. So with Nebo, what we do is we make that return, that required return, more explicit. So here, if we had a required return of 2% real, if we have a 30-year investment horizon, Nebo, through its multi-period optimization, its portfolio that will minimize shortfall relative to the client's goal of a 2% return over a 30% horizon, is a portfolio with 70% in stocks. In contrast, with Money Guide Pro, you have an investment score of 60. It has a portfolio with a percentage stock of 61% and an average return of 5.5%. So with the risk scoring, it is clearly connected, but it's connected to the model portfolio. It's not connected to the plan. With Nebo, the return is based on what the client needs from your financial assets and the time period. So what do I mean by that? So here we have in yellow the required return at the goals for the return at longevity as well as retirement. The return necessary in order to achieve those goals is 2% real. And then Nebo builds a multi-period optimization, a glide path designed to minimize shortfall relative to this client's goals. Now, normally in the process with Nebo, what you would do is you would undertake a viability analysis to see whether this plan is indeed viable. But here we're going to focus on the left side of the left side of the glide path. And here, for the purposes of kind of the comparison, we have the portfolio with 70% in stock, a little bit in short-term, a little bit in long-term bonds, and a little bit in short-term bonds. So when we talk about the portfolio changing, when the plan changes, so let's explore that a bit further. So if the goals for this client changed, say the goal for the client was, all right, what's the minimal feasible required return for this portfolio? If I want to die with zero, which is a great book by Bill Perkins, if I want to go out with my boots on, what's the minimum return necessary in this portfolio in order to achieve my goals? Turns out it's 1% real. So we can take that 1% real, that 1% goal, and feed that back into Nebo. Again, multi-period shortfall optimization, minimizing shortfall relative to our goal of a 1% required return with a 30-year investment horizon. It turns out it's a portfolio with 50% in stock. So the goal changes, the plan changes, the required return changes, the portfolio weight changes. Direct, simple, connected, as opposed to needing to change my risk score to get out of my moderately aggressive portfolio into another portfolio. Now, what we can also do here is we can compare different required returns. So here we have a 1, 1.5, and a 2% required return. Nebo runs his next generation Monte Carlo analysis and separates the outcomes into long-term and short-term. So here, interestingly, the probability of success for all three of these portfolios are all about 86, 87%. They're all right on top of each other, 1, 1.5, or 2%. So we know that they will all work. But the probability of success is a very blunt metric, right? You either run out of money or you don't, yay or nay. There's a lot more nuance underneath the covers. So with Nebo, we can look at what's the median wealth in retirement, 257,000 versus, I can't read that, but 440,000. We can look at the returns at the tails of the distribution. We can look at the average median wealth in retirement. We can look at the average withdrawal in retirement, 4.4% versus 5.3%. These are very different metrics. These are very different portfolio outcomes, even though their probability of success is basically the same. And we can compare that to the short-term drawdown risks. The 2% portfolio has a drawdown 25 to 30% higher versus the 1% portfolio. So as Martin said, it's not that we're ignoring these short-term risks, but we need to balance these short-term risks versus the long-term wealth accumulation needs. And Nebo provides the best data that it can to help the advisor take the client through this process, because the process of choosing your required return is inherently subjective. But with Nebo, we give the best data we can for the advisor in order to help the client make that choice and shepherd that client through that choice. Now, I mentioned Nebo's next generation Monte Carlo analysis. So what do I mean by that? We've written a couple white papers on this topic. We did a webinar last summer, and we asked about 200 advisors. We said, do you use Monte Carlo simulations? 70% said yes. About 80%, however, said that they had issues, concerns with the results. And that probably actually understates these concerns, because those who aren't using Monte Carlos are probably not using Monte Carlos, but they have concern with the results. And so my colleague, Andy Finnegan, he's a big financial Twitter follower. So he saw this tweet by Andrew Miller, who's an advisor at a firm in Indiana, a big advisory firm in Indiana, talking about, can someone please take the time to code a Monte Carlo simulation that incorporates mean reverting returns? And then we also have Mark McGrath talking about a Monte Carlo simulation he ran where the outcomes were 500 million to the upside and running out of money to the downside. So you can pretty much drive a truck through that type of analysis. So when I say next generation Monte Carlo tools. It refers to incorporating the Monte Carlo simulations that Andrew's talking about. And this is something that we did years ago. We didn't do this in response to the tweet. So what do I mean? So within financial planning tools, every financial planning tool that we've seen that uses Monte Carlo simulations is built on the random walk assumption. Burton Malkiel's observation in 1970 that the market follows a random walk. So here what we show is the volatility term structure for stocks and bonds in real terms, assuming the random walks. The random walk says basically the returns in one period are unrelated to the returns in the next period. So like many theories, kind of once you move past Cambridge or the south side of Chicago, you start running into trouble. So here we show what has happened in history in terms of the volatility of stocks and bonds. So you can see that the actual returns for stocks adjusted for inflation, for bonds adjusted for inflation, is much riskier than the random walk would assume. And on stocks, the opposite is true, that stocks are actually less risky relative to what the assumption for the random walk. So if you're using these Monte Carlos in these financial planning tools, your outcomes are artificially wide, they're artificially distorted. This also, so your viability testing is going to be distorted. And also to the extent that you're using, that the financial planning software is using the random walk assumptions in their optimizations, you're going to end up owning bond-heavy portfolios, jeopardizing not only the financial plan, but undermining the actual goals of the client. So an example of this, so here we have the distribution of simulations, top and bottom quartile. In light blue, what you see is the distribution for the Monte Carlo simulations for Nebo. The dark blue is when you're using mean reversion in that when you're using the random walk assumptions in that distribution. So the random walk is in a full 35% wider than what you see within Nebo. And in this particular example, the probability of success for the random walk simulation was actually 78%. With the Nebo, it was 86%. So a lot of times advisors will use 80% as a threshold for whether or not a plan is indeed viable. So here, using the financial planning tools or the financial planning Monte Carlo, the advisor could easily have gone back to the client and said, you need to change your lifestyle, you need to change how you think about retirement, or you need to take more risk in your portfolio. All because they were using a flawed methodology, outdated, overly academic. Nebo solves for that. And this relates to a point, kind of getting back to some of James' behavioral issues related to confidence. Now, I have, this is my 20th GMO conference. And so I'm pretty sure over that entire time period, we've never quoted Ray Dalio. And we've certainly never quoted one of Ray Dalio's principles. A lot of respect for Ray, but it's just not necessarily our cup of tea. But Ray absolutely nails this one. He talks about the biggest threat to good decision making is harmful emotions, kind of Kahneman's system 1 versus system 2 thinking. And the decision-making process is a two-step process, first learning and then deciding. One of the greatest compliments we've gotten from a Nebo advisor is he called Nebo a learning and deciding machine. The idea that by increasing understanding, lowering emotions, producing better decisions over time. Understanding, what do you need to believe in order to own the portfolio that you do? What do you need to believe about the capital markets? What do you need to believe about the client? Understanding the key variables that are driving the allocation to the portfolio. Doing stress tests. What if? What if the stock market falls by 20%? Expected returns rise by 3%. What does that do to your allocation? And for the client, that confidence also flows through. What we hear from Nebo advisors is that the nature of the conversation with clients change. It's not about what the S&P did last quarter. It's not about what the Fed isn't or isn't going to do. It's about what the advisor and the client can control, the plan. One Nebo advisor told us what she particularly loved about Nebo is now her clients are willing to do their homework. They're willing to kind of sharpen their pencils to say, this is what I need in retirement, because they understand the impact of that. Increasing confidence, increasing understanding. So the result of that all is Nebo sits at the center of, so here we have adaptive goals-based investment platform. And we were talking earlier this week, and I think this sells Nebo a bit short. Nebo is a leap forward in the evolution of a goals-based wealth management platform. What do I mean by that? Nebo's not just about investing. What we do is we incorporate the cash flows from all the financial planning work, all the goals work that you do within those financial plans. We incorporate that directly. We integrate that directly into Nebo. Nebo also has light financial planning tools. So if you don't have a full eMoney Money Guide Pro workup, Nebo has tools to help you there as well. Then we take those cash flows, we take that financial plan, and then we apply Nebo's next generation Monte Carlo analysis to determine whether or not that plan is indeed viable, whether that plan is indeed robust. And so this gets back to balancing the return relative to the risk that Martin talked about before. So this is a multidimensional, a 3D investment policy statement. Clear what the goals and objectives are and what the plans are. That can be saved within your CRM system, and then that can reduce your regulatory and compliance risk, all leading to a personalized portfolio. This is personalized for real economic reasons, not bullshit marketing reasons. I felt like I could say bullshit because James said shit earlier, so I'm going to continue with that theme. But this is personalized for real economic reasons. What do you need when you need it? And building a portfolio that is customized to the individual based on their unique needs and circumstances. And that process, that customization process, is streamlined. It's systematized. It's one process for your most complicated clients to your simplest clients. And what that does for the advisor, it increases your efficiency. Fidelity had a study saying that if you can automate this process, that can save you 9 hours, 9.1 hours actually. We've heard similar things from our Nebo advisor. So it allows you to be more efficient, grow in a more controlled fashion, grow more profitably, Nebo as your growth platform. Because what you can also do once you have that portfolio, with a click of the button, we can send that to your rebalancer. Orion, Eclipse, iRebal, and then we're also in the process of building our own rebalancer. So we'll tell you more about that in January of this year. So it streamlines your process, more efficient. It helps advisors build better businesses, and critically helps clients build better helps the advisor build better portfolios for the clients as well. All right, that's our story. We're sticking to it. So guys, you want to come up on stage? So we'd love to answer some questions. We're not letting you out of here until we get 4 questions.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I don't want to go up on you, but I think what James' reasoning was kind of bullocks. So, and luckily, I agree with you in your conclusions, and I often agree with you anyway in writing here. But those functions or correlations that you mentioned, social security numbers, telephone numbers, this is like the old function that you might remember that S&P 500 correlates with tomatoes harvest. I'm making it up in UK, or something like this. So your conclusions stand, as far as I'm concerned. But your reasoning just left us kind of laughing here, at least some of us. So do you want to adjust your reasoning and give a better one? Or you just can leave it alone. We agreed with you.
I like the conclusion. So I think there's a subtle difference, right? You're right. If you look at butter production in Bangladesh and S&P stock market returns, there is a very high correlation. No causality at all, but very high correlation. I think with the studies that have been done on anchoring, it's a much cleaner sample because A, it's cross-sectional, not time series. So those time series are more prone to correlation being confused with causality. Here, with anchoring, you are deliberately manipulating the base piece of information that people have and then asking them a unrelated question. There is no reason, there should be zero correlation, right? There should be zero correlation between whatever the anchor that you set was and whatever the outcome of the question is. The fact that we find consistently across thousands of studies a positive correlation suggests that people are clinging on to this as an input. So I'm going to stand by it, but I'm very happy that we agree on the conclusion.
Yes, sir.
I'm going to ask a more nerdy question. Sorry. You showed the input, you showed the input from Money Guide Pro into Nebo, giving you an output. Okay. Obviously, there's a question here. Can't the output from Nebo feed back into Money Guide Pro? Because that's where, as advisors, we're doing the planning. Because obviously, Nebo doesn't include Social Security, taxes, IRA conversions, all that other stuff. So are you working on a two-way, or is it just going to be one-way input, and then we live at Nebo?
We would love to connect back into the financial planning tools. That is going to be largely a function of the extent to which they open up their systems to what we're doing. Historically, they've been relatively closed, but we'd love to change that. We're not trying to reinvent planning because there's a lot of good things that those financial planning tools do. We're really trying to pick up where we think they leave off, but absolutely, it makes enormous sense for output from Nebo to flow back into the financial planning tools.
What do you need to get them to open up?
Demand from the advisors.
Ask the question again.
Oh, sorry. So the question is, what do you need in order to get the financial planning tools to open up to an outside third party? And it's really demand from the financial advisor community, because the financial advisor community are the clients of the financial planning tools, and that's who they're going to listen to.
Thanks. A question from the virtual audience. I guess first off, is there any institutional implications to this if you're an endowment or foundation? Is there a use case there?
There's absolutely a use case there. In fact, I remember back in, I think it was 2013, Ben and I did it was the first talk on this topic. It was about a decade ago. And I think the last slide we had was how would you apply these concepts to an endowment? So in that case, it's generally relatively straightforward. You have a very long horizon. You have a required return of let's say whatever the withdrawal rate is, around 5%. There is a nuance there, which is a question about when do you start caring about shortfall? Because in the shortfall-based optimization framework, there's actually two horizons in the problem, not one. There's the total horizon that you want the money to last, and for an endowment, it could be infinite, but as a practical matter, 50 years usually works just fine. But there's another horizon, which is when do you start caring about falling short of, let's say, maintained purchasing power? And that matters a great deal as well. And that gets into agency issues. So for example, you have people that are managing the money for the endowment and foundation. Over what horizon are they going to be measured, et cetera? And if you have this target of, say, maintaining purchasing power, when do you care about falling short? So the framework and the concepts we think apply to a very wide range of investment problems.
Maybe another, from the virtual audience, because there's quite a few that came in, just in terms of Nebo requiring particular GMO fund use or forecasts or recommendations of funds, how does the tool work with those?
So Nebo is an open architecture platform. you can use GMO forecasts, but we don't require you to use them. And similarly, with respect to implementation, it's open architecture. So whatever your preferred method of implementation, stocks, individual stocks, ETFs, mutual funds, it's all open architecture. All right, so what I would, if this is of any interest to you at all, I'd encourage you to reach out, tackle us in the hallway. You can just Google Nebo GMO. We have a ton of stuff. We have some James behavioral white papers there. We have presentations. We have other white papers. We have webinars. We got a ton of things to help educate you on Nebo. You can also book a demo. We love talking about this stuff and love to talk to you to see whether it's a fit for you and your firm. All right, thank you. Enjoy the rest of the day.